Alright, so we have 5 movies this week. The awards movies are still evading me, as they have been, but we've got a few visual effects contenders in here at least, among a couple of others. So, and a new Netflix release, obviously. So, we'll just go into this. We'll start with the big ones and then kind of work our way down, starting with Aquaman. As far as the whole DC universe goes, obviously I've talked about, I think, all of them on here in some capacity, and for the most part, I understand how a lot of people see the sort of DC universe now as like this big old clusterfuck, like to the point that it's really falling apart as we speak, with the exception of these standalone ones like Wonder Woman and now this one, which seem to be doing just fine. And there hasn't been a movie in this universe yet that I've like hated or anything. Like, obviously, Batman vs Superman, I'm kind of indifferent on. Suicide Squad, I'm indifferent on, despite the fact, even partaking in the merchandising, I'm still always finding something to hate about it. But like Man of Steel, I think is perfectly fine and actually like legitimately good. And then obviously Wonder Woman and this Justice League is what it is. Like it almost might as well not even exist. But so going into this, I didn't really have like much overwhelming anticipation, but I wasn't like thinking I was gonna hate it or anything either. Especially since I guess I'm wrong. There was a little bit of hype that I did have. And the thing that I kept coming back to was that this movie cannot fail because James Wan is directing it, who I'm obviously a huge fan of. And it was one of those cases where I pretty much kept an eye on the production as it was going prior to filming, because I was like so dreading getting the news that Wan was going to drop out, because it was like if that were the case, the movie was probably going to sink. No, there's some kind of pun in there, but fuck it. So what I did kind of like immediately was that they do have origin story cliches and all that. Particularly the whole they need to show like the power that the kid has. So in order to do that, of course they're going to use bullies. Bullies that are never built up and bullies that never come back again. They are strictly here just to show this scene that takes us into the fish and then seeing the title. Which is actually a really good scene, despite the whole bully angle seems a bit played out and obvious and lazy. But the part about this that I do like is the fact that this movie is like an origin story, but instead of getting like this whole thing, like his whole childhood and being trained by Willem Dafoe and all that, is at the we do get the glimpse of that at the beginning, but instead of continuing on from there and us getting in chronological order, the fact that they stuck that in places throughout the movie that just kind of called for it, that kind of were working their way into this also. So, something sort of like what Suicide Squad was trying to do and just made it even more jumbled, but it actually works really nice and cohesively here, thank God. Um, so that right away is a really good start, because if this were like some boring origin movie for like the entire first half, it would have totally changed the impact of the movie as a whole. But the fact that it's willing to just go right into it and then just show that stuff when need be is going to help a lot throughout, especially when we can get right to some of the good stuff and make it feel like we're not it doesn't necessarily always feel like we're waiting on something. There's always the kind of thing that we came here for is spread throughout because they were able to do it in that fashion. And even this first action scene comes very quickly and kind of unexpectedly too. Despite the fact that they do the whole a fight sequence interrupts, more downplayed moment many times. This first time is certainly effective, especially when we get a Nicole Kidman action scene. That's in that really nice Wan style where there's not a whole lot of cuts and the camera gets to do. I just love how adventurous he is with camera movement and how he'll pretty much do anything with it, whether it be a transition or how an action scene is shown or anything like that. We even get his sort of trademark thing where the camera will turn if somebody is like thrown in that direction. Sort of like the scene in Furious 7, and I think he came back and did it in another movie also. And when you see stuff like that, you could say like, oh, he's just reusing tactics and all that, and he's run out of ideas and all that. But no, he's like I said, he's so sort of fluid in how he likes to use the camera. When it's something that you actually recognize, it definitely comes off more as like just a little trademark, like just a little, James Wan's signature, as opposed to it being seeming like it's the same sort of style, because it's really, as I said, he seems all about doing all the different ways of presenting what he's showing, which I really love. Um, and then, yeah, and then obviously that goes pretty much right into this whole submarine thing, and there will be times throughout this, I'm sure, because obviously there's so many superhero movies now from either Marvel or DC or even otherwise, that there's just, like, you're never gonna go a reviewer talking about a movie without comparing it to another one. So I'm sure people will see the submarine scene and sort of be like, yeah, this kind of somewhat reminds me of the boat scene at the beginning of The Winter Soldier. Or there's a scene in the middle with an organized duel between him and Patrick Wilson, and it's like, you think organized duel, I'm sure, especially since it's so fresh, Black Panther will probably come to mind for sure. Um, but there's still so much more to this movie, because this is obviously a movie that's been something people have been trying to kind of envision for a long time. Obviously, there was the whole entourage thing and stuff like that, but after a while, it just became this sort of almost joke where it's like, how do you do this movie, especially with this in this era of everything being a little too much CGI and all that? And obviously, like, a lot of people, like, when the early reviews were coming out, were saying, like, oh, it's so CGI heavy, just like all the other blockbusters. But it's like, I don't know that you can make a movie that's set underwater without that. I think that just has to be expected. That's not really much of a criticism to say it's CGI heavy. Maybe, like, sure, when they're, like, on the surface, I guess. But, I mean, they can only do so much before they, they have to just create. And the fact that that in itself is so well done most of the time is really what's going to help also. Like, these underwater scenes are like, whether it's moments like when we see, like, when they introduce the whole his eyes adjusting thing, and we see that whole thing, and then yeah, like I said, it's really hard to even describe, which is really great, because obviously you've got, people riding seahorses and people riding sharks and all that, but there's also not just how it was going to be made, but if it was ever going to be, because we kind of keep flip flopping on what's the current trend in superhero movies, whether it's being goofy or being really dark and brooding and all that. Just kind of seems to constantly go back and forth which one people want. And it's usually the opposite. When everything's being happy, people want dark and broody. When it's being dark and broody, people want it to be happy, and nobody's pleased ever. So to take this concept, it's like there's not really much you can do in the dark broody angle with this. You've pretty much got to embrace the goofiness you're going to run into inevitably. But the great thing that Juan does here with his approach is that it seems like they know, like, the goofiness of it and what exactly this is. It's a dude that can talk to fish, and people are riding sharks and seahorses and all that. But it still takes itself seriously enough, but not in the way that it's like asking you to, because there is a line there to where it's like they can take themselves seriously without expecting us to as an audience when we're actually seeing it, and that kind of adds a layer to it also, because there's like, obviously there's like some real emotion in it. There's the whole thing with his dad, where it was like, and I like the way they kind of turned that on its head too a little bit, where it was like, as soon as I saw the dad, he like went up to the surface and they hugged and everything, your immediate response is, oh well, he's clearly going to die in the next 5 minutes. But that the dad actually goes in like this genuinely emotional direction and gets to have that, was a really nice change of pace also. Occasionally, like I said, it does sort of turn things on its head like that, but there's also, many predictable directions it's going to go in also. Particularly, like, the casting of Nicole Kidman as his mother, where it's like, she has the one action scene at the beginning, and then she disappears back into the water, and we just kind of hear, like, oh yeah, she was tortured, and oh yeah, she was, like, killed at some point, apparently, I guess. And it's like, well, number one, we never saw this happen, and secondly, she's played by Nicole Kidman. So yeah, you just keep telling us she's dead. We'll believe you. We'll totally, completely believe you the whole time. But obviously, even then, sometimes it just sort of comes with the material, that there's a bit of a predictability to it or something. I like to think of it, when I'm feeling positive, I like to think of it more as something you can rely on to happen. Makes it sound a bit more, not as negative. So there's also some of the stuff they add in here that sort of gives it the similar feel of what was going on in the other movies, like the scenes in Batman vs Superman when they're on the news and like having those moral debates and all that. There is something similar here to where like the media, we see the media debating with like Randall Park and stuff like that. That sort of brings that back. Um, which is nice, and I like the fact that they didn't like overdo that and try to make it some overly philosophical thing. It's just like, yeah, this is happening, and it kind of adds a sort of interesting reality sort of feel to this really fantastical, totally not realistic scenario. So it's nice to kind of try and blend that as much as you can even when you have something so outlandish going on at the center. Um, every now and then, obviously, you are gonna have like some dumb jokes, like the some obvious jokes, like when they're at the bar and the big bikers come up and they look like they're gonna try to beat his ass, but oh, they just want selfies, and oh, one of them has a pink cell phone case and shit like that. That's just going to be in there because you know, it's a blockbuster. That's just what they do. But then there's also some stuff that's like seems like a dumb joke, but interestingly enough, like for instance when you've got the guys that they're fighting in the suits with the water, like a reverse Sandy Cheeks situation going on. And it's like somebody ends up with their face in a toilet, but instead of feeling like a dumb joke, it's like the most logical thing that could happen in this scenario. Is somehow they managed to get to that point. Um, so when it works like that, it's not so bad. And then also the way they really use the settings also. Like when you talk about, there's going to be stuff on the surface and there's going to be all the underwater stuff. The way that they use it feels like there's so many different settings, which is really cool, especially when you've got like the really, really stark contrast of 1 minute, they're underwater, the next they're in the middle of the desert. And it just sort of has that constant thing going and feels like the whole thing feels like it has like this constant momentum going. Every now and then it might like slow down a little bit and it might get, a bit bloated because it is like almost 2.5 hours like most superhero movies anymore, but for the most part it did feel like it had a sort of constant momentum going, so I was very appreciative of that. And the fact that we got to feel like how massive it felt a lot of the times. Like there's like the one particular shot where it's like we're just sort of watching them and then we see like a statue, and then as it's like coming out and showing everything, you realize just how small they are in this massive world. And then you get imagery down to the giant octopus drumming surrounded by lava. And it's like you feel like they just kind of threw everything they possibly could into it to make it as big as possible. And for a movie like this, that's really the best way to go into it, especially if you've got as much control as Juan clearly does. Like I said, it may feel like they put a little too much in it, and sure, there's some things here, like the whole Black Mana thing feels a bit underdeveloped, even though we know where that's going, obviously, but still, in this particular case, it did seem like there was a lot of build-up for what seemed like a small payoff, and then, obviously, when you stick around, you know, but even so, like I said, just kind of throwing everything into it, even if some things feel underdeveloped or some things feel unnecessary, I don't really see this going any other way, other than to just do that, to really just show that this is what we're dealing with, and this is just how big and fantastical it is. So I thought that actually was appropriate. Obviously I was saying it does slow down sometimes, but it's like, but they always find a way it comes back in a big way, like the whole Italy thing, where they go on what seems to be this sort of date thing, where they eat flowers and shit, that's weird, and the whole Amber Heard thing feels like we're supposed to care about it a lot more than we actually do. Despite the fact that she does bring on some cool visual stuff, like the whole jellyfish thing, but and then the whole fountain thing with the little girl and stuff like that are really nice moments before we break into another giant action scene. But once again, the action scenes themselves work so well. It's, like I said, feel constant but spread out at the same time enough to where it doesn't feel like it's bombarding us with everything. So Yeah, and obviously every now and then there's going to be, like, you know, annoying plot conveniences, and like I said, that predictability where, like, things just happen to be in a certain place or all that, or somebody just happens to fall into something. Even so, it's with everything else in this movie, it's pretty easy to look past things like that, and it's like this, it's gotta go somewhere, obviously, and it moves quite nicely. So yeah, so that's pretty much how I feel about that overall. And like I said, really the main thing to take away from is the fact that, like I said, they really embrace just how insane it all is. But like I said, in such a big way, but also enough to where they take themselves seriously enough to have, you know, those actual character moments that really do have impact when they happen. Like, I mean, towards the end, obviously, he's going to have this triumphant rise of sorts, and that's just feels like such a huge, magnificent moment that I really love. So, yeah. So I can see the reaction on this being mixed, like everything else in the series, but I'm really quite pleased with this. So, yeah, that's what that is. Going on to Bumblebee, another movie that is continuing or going back and being a prequel to, I guess you could say, another franchise with questionable quality that people have many varying different opinions on. So the interesting thing about this, obviously at the very start, was the critical acclaim it started to receive very quickly, to the point that they got so confident they even did that, like that one night only screening, like a couple of weeks ago or something, over one of the weekends. And it's like you only do that when you're really, really sure that word of mouth is gonna be good. Um, and obviously it does help that this is like our first Transformers movie since what, the animated one, that's not directed by Michael Bay. But not only that, but the director is Travis Knight, who did Kubo and the Two Strings. Like this is the only other. Obviously, he worked on like the Box Trolls and Coraline and stuff like that. But this is like the only second movie he's directed after Kubo and the Two Strings, which obviously was great and one of the better animated movies of this decade at least. Um, and the first thing I did hear that's something that I don't really have like passion in talking about, but is still worth noting, because Transformers wasn't really something that I like grew up with. I only like knew it in name vaguely from other people. But it's to my understanding from something I was reading that I guess the Transformer designs in this movie are like much more, and as you can see when you go back and see like how like Knight's precision when he makes something like Kubo and the Two Strings, that there's that similar precision in like the design of the Transformers themselves, because apparently with Bay and his team kind of like took shortcuts in the CGI process and made them not look as, I guess, the way they're supposed to, and a bit more like the way the movement is and their mechanics and all that. So apparently that is like extremely accurate from what I understand. But obviously I do not really know much about this otherwise. So as it goes into that, after we're introduced to all that, we're introduced to the human characters, which is usually the downside of these Transformer movies, because Bay's movies didn't have a whole lot to work with that, despite the fact that they dragged it on and on and on, clearly. So our main person here is Haley Steinfeld, who is a very interesting choice, because she obviously she fits in with she'll bring in that teen demographic, but at the same time she's also extremely talented, which she obviously showed at the start of her career with True Grit. But then with stuff like Edge of 17 proves that she's got like this endless likability to her and this kind of relatability to anybody, and it's so that's kind of a really good place to start, and kind of gives it a heart, because it is one of those cases where we're gonna have, you know, a cliche backstory. She's gonna have a dead dad. She's gonna have a mom that's got a new boyfriend. She's gonna hate her life. She's gonna be bullied by other people, those damn bullies. She's gonna have a nerd that has a crush on her. All that shit. She's got a job she hates. It's all here. Like every single fuck my life cliche this girl will have is here. And of course it starts in 1980. No, it takes place entirely. It doesn't go anywhere else in 1987. So of course we're gonna do the whole 80s thing, because we're still doing that apparently. So we've got all the 80s music, we've got the 80s movie references, we've got Mr. T cereal, we've got Alf, everything. On top of a Breakfast Club, bringing the Breakfast Club up multiple times, I'm pretty sure Tina, the bully's house, it was used in like a number of 80s movies, like 16 Candles and stuff like that. That or it looks exactly like it, I don't know. But, and of course, the thing about this 80s thing is we're going to have a lot of E.T. references. Like E.T. influence, I guess you could say. That's going to become more and more and more and more and more obvious as it goes on, particularly with the entrance of John Cena's character, who we meet at the beginning and see throughout, but overall he's just Peter Coyote and E.T. or Noah Emmerich and Super 8, whichever one you want to go with. The dude that wants to get the alien thing that's part of the military and take it in for testing, but the young kid who has an attraction to it has to hide him so they don't get to it. Also hiding him from her family and all that. The movie is E.T. with a giant robot, and it doesn't really try too much to get past that. It's almost like it sort of embraces it. But I do think it probably could have done a bit more with that, especially with, you know, all the creativity you could have here. Every now and then, like I said, they tend to go against some cliches. Like, I kind of like the fact that the mom's new boyfriend is, like, legitimately a nice guy instead of just the douchebag and kind of, like, actually giving her a reason to hate him and all that. But no, really the problem's just on her and how much she hates her life and how much she misses her dad and all that. And that's the thing, too, is for the most part, we have likable characters. Also, like, who would she say? Her uncle, I think she said, was the old guy that, like, gives her the car. Those are nice interactions and stuff like that, and stuff that, you know, it was missing before. There is some genuine emotion also, like, when she talks about her dad. Like I said, it's a whole cliche thing, but, like, the whole, just her performance and with Unchained Melody playing and all that stuff, it actually does really work. But the thing is it is one of those movies that it's doing all this stuff right, for sure. And like, even if it's, you know, really going after the cliches or, you know, like an E.T. influence or whatever, it does feel like a good movie, at least for the first half. And then you kind of keep questioning, though, is it like, now is this legitimately good, or does this movie have the tremendous luck of being a decent movie that just happens to follow a critically despised franchise? And it's like, whenever people hear, like, every Transformers movie, people were like, oh, it's gonna, even though people went out in droves, still, people were like, oh, this is gonna be so bad, this is the death of movies, this is the worst thing ever. And then it's like when you think, oh, well, now we're gonna continue that, but it's gonna be kind of like a spin-off / prequel thing, and you think, oh, so it's gonna be worse. It has to be, right? And this is the movie that comes out. Obviously, it's going to seem like a masterpiece by comparison. But, like I said, I'm not saying that the critical acclaim is not sincere, because the things that it does do right, it really does do right, even when you're not comparing them. Particularly the emotion with Steinfeld's character. But I do think that there's still kind of a lot to be desired, especially with, like I said, how much it takes on its influences, especially in the second half, when it pretty much becomes a movie we've seen a billion times before. It kind of started to lose me. So, and you also have, like, there's some times where, like I said, most of the characters are like, well, sometimes you have to do the whole bully thing, or the nerd thing, and it's like, well, first off, they seem to be trying to do something here where they're trying to, you know, like, right the wrongs of the other series. So it's like, they do the thing where it's like they're trying to do blatant reversals. So where Michael Bay's movie is like, the camera lingers on, you know, women in really bizarre ways and really obvious ways. Megan Fox bending over shit and all that. Here you've got, like, as many dudes as possible ripping their shirts off for seemingly no reason. And you've got, like, you know, the character earlier that likes her that's saying, like, oh no, I'm a nerd, I'm such a nerd, I'm a nerd that apparently lives in the gym. And it's that kind of thing, and it's like, I can kind of see what they're doing, trying to go against that, but it's like, it's also kind of a two wrongs don't make a right scenario, too, and it's like, what exactly are you accomplishing? Like, if you wanted to really stick it to Bay, like, objectifying people, maybe don't do it at all, if you really want to make a point, but okay, if it's like a fuck you to the other movies, then, you know, more power to it, I guess. Um, but then there's also the whole bully thing is really just a way to have Bumblebee cause some innocent trouble. Well, semi-innocent. It's depending on how much damage this ended up costing, which we never learn. Um, but the whole thing of it just feels like a giant setup more than anything else, rather than anything character related. Because you got this, for the most part, her life seems very real, if cliche. Like, if anything, the cliches make her life feel more real because it's shit that most people go through. So you can give it that, but at the same time, the this bully character does make it feel like a bit too over the top, almost like the bullies in an '80s movie, which really would not surprise me at all if that's what they were going for. But for her to literally say stuff like there's hardly any provocation between these two. Like, it's not even clear why they don't like each other and why the bully antagonizes her. But even to say things like, I don't remember the exact quote now, but she brings up the fact that her dad's dead to her face to provoke her for seemingly no reason, and it's like, it's a bit, and the fact that Steinfeld's character just sort of takes it, kind of feels a bit out of character, and yeah, it just feels really off and sort of goes in this direction where it's like, it's this starting point where you can see the entire rest of that storyline playing out already, and it just has to do its thing. When it seems like it's trying to do something fresh, it goes way too many times in those kind of directions. So, and they even do like obviously they were always going to have some fun with the whole Bumblebee has to talk through music thing, which is nice for the most part, and even has a couple of emotional moments here and there. But then it's like they also throw in the Rick Astley thing, and it's like, are we really still doing that? It's like, so every now and then the movie does feel like almost as dated as the time period in which it's set, which, like I said, could probably be endlessly defended with, that's the point. But I mean, how many times has this been the point? We can get out of this '80s thing now. So I don't know how long this was in production. I'm sure when it was, the '80s thing was still totally booming, but I really feel like it's dying down at this point. But yeah, here it is. So yeah, for the most part, like I said, I like the first half a lot more than the second, and it obviously is a clear step up. And if they want to, keep going in that direction, there's something here, but we'll see if they can maybe get some new ideas and new directions, and then maybe see what they're going to do. Because if they're just going to keep doing the whole, hey, let's reference other things thing, they're not really going to get very far before they're right back into the territory they were in. So, yeah, that's pretty much how I feel about that. So, let's go on to Welcome to Marwen. This is, like, I knew this movie existed, I knew Steve Carell was in it, and I knew it was Zemeckis' new movie. And apart from that, I really didn't know what it was. And let me tell you, this is a fucked up movie to go into when you have no idea what it's supposed to be about. And you have to figure it out for yourself. So I knew, like, a little bit about it. Like, I knew the whole, well, here's the thing. There are two ways you can see this movie, and I imagine there's going to be two ways only in which audiences view it. Obviously, it's the true story of a very damaged dude who was beaten severely in, like, a bar fight or an altercation, and pretty much lost all of his memories. Like, he can still do, some things, like math and stuff is still in there, but, like, his ability to draw and all that, and memories of the people in his past are, like, gone. And now he just leads this broken existence, making these dolls and making, like, art installations out of them, but also living vicariously through them, and with dolls representing the women in his life that sort of keep him afloat, or the ones in his past, or ones that are in his subconscious that maybe represent people that he'll have to slowly figure out exactly what's going on in his own little world here. You can see it as that, or a lot of people will probably see this as a serial killer movie in the making. Depending on how much sensitivity you have towards the main character and what it is that he's doing here. it might be a little too weird for some people to fully get on board and sympathize for him, but you're going to have that. But when it starts, he's doing this, and then Leslie Mann moves in across the street. And in case you forgot what Zemeckis' last movie was, it's an Allied moving van in big letters. So, just in case we forgot. So of course she's going to add a bit of complications, especially since she's got this ex who is very aggressive and is also going to work his way into the imaginary world and have his own doll that represents him, who's probably going to be a Nazi authority figure, given that this whole setting that he's living vicariously through, it has a World War II setting, for whatever reason. And so as far as the effects go, I was really, like, as weird as it may seem to anybody, you cannot deny that the effects are kind of amazing with how it's clear, like, the motion capture work he's done with, like, the Polar Express and A Christmas Carol and that Beowulf movie, I think was his, too. And making these actors and actresses look like these dolls, like these living dolls, and it's like, at first it kind of looked weird because you could tell how animated Steve Carell's face looked, but once they started moving around and you saw, like, all the different doll parts and the mechanics, it was like, it was fucking crazy. In kind of a good way, how well this is done. Because when you just kind of talk about this, or you see it on paper, it's kind of like, that's an odd concept. But obviously, if anybody's going to pull that off, a mind like Zemeckis' was going to get us there. Regardless of what people have said in the past about the potential creepiness factor of the human characters in movies like The Polar Express and how they just look like dead faces or whatever. But no, this actually looks amazing, especially since the faces are kind of meant to look dead since they're supposed to be dolls that just happen to be moving. And so, yeah, and at the start I kind of thought, like, when I heard the initial storyline of he got beaten really badly and lost his memory and stuff like that, I was kind of expecting, like a movie kind of like Regarding Henry, with Harrison Ford, just with all this other stuff thrown into it. It's a bit more, I don't know. There's kind of a lot going on here, but like I said, it really depends on how you take the main character, because he's also got this thing going on where he's got, like, a fascination with women's clothing, particularly shoes, but he says that he collects the shoes because he collects women's essence. He says this to correct Leslie Mann when she calls it a fetish. And that's kind of the thing, is you would think at some point you would finally, throughout the movie, decide whether you sympathize with him or you think he's, beyond lost. Especially since he's based on a real dude. But, I still have not quite come to the conclusion how I feel about this character, and I feel like that's not how I should be feeling. Because you do have, there is something about the movie itself apart from that. Like, watching, the doll characters and kind of figuring out who's who in his life and exactly how what they do in his real life will incorporate in the World War II world that he set up. So there is something interesting there. And then this whole Diane Kruger character that's, like, floating. Like, some of the characters you kind of, like, sort of, it takes you a minute to piece together who they are. Like, Diane Kruger's face, you know immediately. And there's also kind of a mystery surrounding who or what exactly Diane Kruger represents. So there is, like, an engaging factor there. And like I said, the effects are certainly helping also, like, particularly even though with the motion capture and all that, they look like they're moving like real people, but at the same time you can tell they're made of doll parts. Like, after they, like, get shot or fall over and they land in, like, that action figure stance, when you just, like, knock them over or whatever, the little details like that, and the way that they're clearly having fun with the fact that this is, like, some world inside another dude's mind. Like, they have, like, intentionally bad one-liners. There's, like, a Wilhelm scream, and all that, where it does have this sort of, almost like it's trying to take on the vibe of, like, a 40s war movie or whatever. But, and like I said, the way this comes into it is, like, the one-liners inside kind of come back into real life like when he and Leslie Mann, there's like one scene where they seem to find almost a connection in their ability to make up bad puns. And there's stuff like that that ends up coming in throughout, but still, I don't know. And there's some decent transitions too, especially on the effects front. Like when whenever he goes anywhere, he won't go anywhere without them. But since they are alive to him more or less, they have to go by jeep that he pulls with him, like a wagon of sorts. And at one point, it's like them clearly doing motion capture in the jeep and all that, and then it like just pulls back, and it's them going back into dolls, and it's him pulling them. So it's like transitions like that are really great too. But like I said, as far as the story itself and where the emotion lies, just really, that's all I can keep saying is I really don't know how I feel. But in especially also with like some of the directions the Leslie Mann character goes. Because obviously his reality in that line is like all messed up at this point. And so when he meets Leslie Mann, the first thing he does is he goes out and he gets a doll that happens to look exactly like her and names it after her, like he has done with every other woman he's met since this accident or incident. And which, like I said, even if he is a damaged dude and this is how he copes, it's an odd thing to have to try to embrace. So when we get to the point to where Leslie Mann is sort of figuring this out, because when she first sees his whole town set up, at first she's startled because she happens to see a scene where the doll that looks like him is being tortured by Nazis. And she seems horrified, almost to the point of overreaction, really. But then she's like instantly fascinated, and they've just met face to face like 30 seconds ago, and she is like instantly fascinated with this world that he's created, which seems a bit fast. But then that's followed up later with a moment when he's talking about her doll, but instead of referring to it as the doll, he just says you. And it's like, there's almost like a confrontation here where she's like, don't you mean the doll? Like, she's getting a little freaked out. But then she just kind of lets that slide, and it doesn't go in that direction, really. And she's also got a little piece of backstory that they show, like, once through a picture on, like, a stand that she has in her house. And as far as I know, apart from playing up that they're both damaged people, like, have emotional damage from the past, that has nothing to do with anything ever again. Unless I've completely forgotten, but that seemed a bit odd also. But so like I said, it seems like a whole bunch of surface level stuff, really, despite how deep it's seemingly going for with all the symbolism, or it's almost too unsubtle to be even called symbolism, I think. But just the back and forth here, I don't know. And then it starts to get, like, a little silly. Like, the whole... Obviously, I know it's kind of seeing it from inside his mind, but the guy, Kurt, that's the dude that's supposedly with Leslie Mann, or was at one point, that keeps coming around, it's sort of like the antagonist in this little setup now, is like so over dramatized, and like I'm sure that's the point since we're kind of seeing it through his mind. But even so, and then he gets to the point where like one of the girls that he sees as a figure in his life is a girl that he apparently watches in a porn, and then he starts to visualize one of the Nazis in this porn to show that they're breaking into his life. I don't... You see what I mean? I don't know. So, that's... And even then, though, it's like, when it gets to the moments where these are supposedly big, triumphant moments for him, like, as it goes on, and the doll thing gets more and more extreme, like I said, even though we're headed towards something that's going to potentially be triumphant for him, it just feels like the more we get into it, the more his mental state is worsening, because it's getting more and more into it. But apparently it's supposed to be the opposite, but So, that's pretty much what's going on here. I do, like I said, I do like the whole thing of him having, like, no memories, so it's like, even if, it's nice to sort of have a puzzle to piece together and all that, still, the fact that he, lost his memories and all that, there is, like, that's another thing that comes into how we don't know how we're supposed to take him, because we never really get a glimpse of what he was prior to the beating, before he was clearly a different person. So that's sort of tough to gauge, really, also. So it feels like a whole lot's missing here that we should probably know before we make any sort of judgment about this character, including just jumping right on board and totally, completely sympathizing, because God knows where some of this stuff could be coming from. So yeah, like I said, really, if anything, it's just a bit too weird to be fully engaging, and like I said, I don't feel like we know enough about him, despite the fact that we spend a lot of time, like, in his mind. But even so, it's the mind that he's had only recently, so it's really hard to say. But I mean, it's got some really nice performances, particularly from Carell, obviously. Some really, really standout effects. But apart from that, that's what it is. So, let's now go on to the Netflix release of this weekend, which was Bird Box. I did read the book that this movie is based on, so I was really interested, of course, as many people were, even when they heard the concept, especially after you've read the book. The main question in your head is, okay, how's this going to translate to film? Because a lot of it in the book kind of takes place behind the blindfolds, and we get to they sort of have a lot of fun creating such an unknown terror with that, and that's really effective. So it's like, how are you going to do this without making it like a point of view movie that's just a black screen, for most of it anyway, when they're not inside the house playing survival and all that. And so when it starts off, there's been a lot of comparisons to a lot of different movies as far as the concept goes. I don't know how many people, though, have mentioned The Happening. And I know that sounds a bit dire to compare a movie to The Happening. But this whole concept of this unknown force just making people kill themselves in really violent ways. But it's as opposed to The Happening just being it happening, like breathing in the air or whatever the hell it was. You have they see something that's never really fully revealed in regards, like, whether it's creatures, whether it's something else. I think the movie alludes to it being like creatures of sorts, but yeah. So and then there's definitely a horrifying factor here that could totally translate to screen well, but it really just depends on the execution. And another thing, though, is the format, where we're jumping around with timelines here, because we're obviously starting with Sandra Bullock and her two children. And this really, commanding opening scene where Bullock's telling them the rules for when they blindfold themselves and they have to get into a boat and go down the river without looking. And her performance, like, right at the very front is, like, really, really solid. So, and sells this, like, immediately sells, like, the intensity and the urgency of the situation, like, right away, before anything has happened. And then, obviously, we're going to cut back and forth between this and her finding a safe house back when it was initially happening. The boat stuff is, like, 5 years after the fact. And then she finds this safe house that's got, like, John Malkovich, Trevante Rhodes, Jackie Weaver, and a number of people in it. Machine Gun Kelly, for some reason. Eventually, Danielle McDonald, Tom Hollander, a whole bunch of people in this house. Laura Howery. I believe there's quite a few. My memory of the book is slightly vague, but I feel like there's a lot more people in the movie than there were in the book. And also, I think that's kind of and I hate to kind of make this a whole, this is what the book did, this is what the movie did review, but it's probably going to happen anyway, even if I try not to. The thing about that I remember about the book that I think probably would have helped the movie a lot is, and once again, maybe this was the way it was in the book and I just don't remember, but my memory of the book is feeling really claustrophobic in this house. Like, it felt like this really, small post-apocalypse house, whereas in the movie it's like a rich person's house. Like, there's a lot of rooms and there's a lot of open space. once again, maybe that's to make it a bit more filmable, but the claustrophobic aspect I felt really had a certain, effective feel to it, and just sort of adds to the whole tension of it, especially with, the more and more people that start showing up, the more the tensions will rise and all that. B.D. Wong is somebody I forgot to mention also. So the way they set up the world also is more or less nicely done. Like there's little things there like obviously sometimes it feels like maybe the effect will be lost a little bit if we see too much too much more than they see. But every now and then you get little moments like when they're walking through the yard and there's like a skeleton there. It's like God knows who it is or how long it's been there. And the fact that they may or may not know that it's right there beside them is kind of creepy. But the thing though is it's like, how much are you going to sacrifice showing us without giving it, what the book had going for it, where it was like our imaginations got to be in the same place as theirs in regards to we don't know what we're looking at or what's surrounding us and all that. There's one scene involving a dude when they're going down the river. Obviously, the whole thing where once you see it, it makes you go completely insane before you end up killing yourself or whatever. And some of those are really effective. Like sometimes people just walk into the road, but then other times like there's a woman that just calmly sits inside of a burning car. And then sometimes it's more aggressive. Like the first one we see is the woman bashing her head against the window. And I like the way they allude to her too when she's we see Bullock walking down the hallway and the camera like lingers on her and we're like wondering why. And we learn quickly why. So that's a really nice effect. But also what I was talking about was the scene where they're on the boat and there's a guy out there that's trying to get them to take their blindfolds off who has clearly already been affected. And it may seem like a bit, maybe like a risky choice and maybe like this could totally go wrong. But if you were going to do like one scene like entirely behind the blindfold without showing what's going on, it probably would have had to have been this scene where you just hear the guy's voice and he's like getting closer and closer, and the closer he gets, like the more aggressive he's getting as the more it takes over him and all that. But it just kind of turns into a brief action scene, and it's fine as it is, I guess. But I feel like if you wanted to experiment a little bit with how you told this story visually, you probably could have had some fun with that. And we do kind of get that in this scene that may have been added. I don't remember this in the book at all, but them deciding to get into the car and then, cover up all the windows and then get to a supermarket that's been abandoned that's got a whole bunch of groceries still in it, strictly based on GPS, and just kind of have to drive blindly through the roads and just hearing what's on the outside. We do end up getting glimpses of what's on the outside, and sometimes that is effective, so we get like just a brief glimpse of what exactly we're supposed to be afraid of. But I do like that most of this is spent inside the car, and we just kind of hear what's going on. Like, we do see them, like, run over a body or something, and they have to wonder what it was, and it's like, it would be... You are treading a line here of what may have come off, not as effective or whatever, but just sort of seeing them feel that bump and not know what it was would probably have been a bit more, effective, but I do like the concept of this scene in general, though, and the fact that they did use that technique for the most part. So more stuff like that probably would have helped. And there's also stuff that feels a bit watered down, like one of the characters, like, they decide, like, whatever they see that makes them go crazy, like, does it still have that effect when it's, like, camera footage of it? So a dude, like, ties himself to the chair and, like, watches a laptop just to see what happens. And the outcome of this was, like, significantly more disturbing and graphic in the book, the way it was described. And in the book, it was something that had already happened that was being described to the Bullock character. In the movie, we actually see it happen, but it's... I guess when you already know what happened in the book, it's like it does feel a bit underwhelming. This is kind of the problem with doing the book versus movie thing, because you're kind of constantly doing that, and it's kind of harder to give the movie its own merits, but sometimes that happens. So especially with something like this, where when you see the book and you're like, in your head you almost think it's a practically unfilmable concept. So it's kind of inevitable there'll be comparisons. Um, as far as the other characters go, there is, like I said, you've got a very strong cast here, and it's not really it's really not much of a movie that calls for, like, you would think that this sort of scenario would bring on, a lot of drama and all that, but it's mostly, and that's not to say that it's not, effective as like a strictly horror or terror movie or whatever, but and you do have to have certain performances to bring out the terror in that also, but it's not really that heavy on that. It's mostly about the concept itself and what's going on in the movie as opposed to much of the characters in it, despite the fact that, like, there probably could have been more. I think that's the problem, is the whole, there's probably too many characters, and it would have been a lot easier to, like, it would have been better to, like, focus on just, like, a few of them and really make it so, like, it's really genuinely emotional and we really feel like we're losing something if we lose a character. There's one thing that really sells that in the book that's not in the movie at all, where they have a radio that's playing and it's like a DJ that has survived. Sort of similar to the Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, where it was the guy in the store across from them that they kind of kept contact with. But it's a guy that is just on the. They don't communicate with him or anything, but he's just on the radio, and he's a DJ that's just sort of, just kind of going through all this, just on the air, just kind of talking to himself. And then there's this big sort of loneliness factor and, like, this isolation factor when they just kind of stop hearing him, and they realize what's probably happened. And they kind of, if I remember correctly, they kind of hear him losing it before they just don't hear him at all. And it's like, that's something that's like, that kind of impact and effective stuff is kind of what's missing in this movie, that makes it just feel more or less like a standard, apocalyptic movie. And it's, yeah, and every now and then, like I was talking about with the character stuff, it's like, this is something that's going to plague, like, all these apocalypse movies, where it's like, people tend to get over deaths a little too quickly. But so yeah, it's really just eventually turns into like a standard apocalypse movie. But then it gets to a point where there's a couple of climaxes here. There is what feels like the climax, and then there's like an extra half hour where we get a couple of much less impactful climaxes. Because, well, the other thing about that too is this is where you kind of wonder how useful or how much of a hindrance the timeline is going to be, jumping back and forth. Because it's like, because we know the setup where Bullock and the two kids is where we're at now, we're kind of just waiting for certain things to happen, because we know it's at least in some way where we're going to end up. And the fact that the movie takes a while to get there, because I remember after reading the book, I was like, this could be like, a nice, tight 90-minute movie, sure, if they can do it right and execute it right. They got it to 1 minute over 2 hours. It's like, as soon as I saw that runtime on Netflix, it was like, oh, wonder what they did. So yeah, there is, like, sort of too much here, and it does drag itself out a little too much. And like I said, it probably would have been much better as more of a claustrophobic thing with less characters and more care about them and more implied, terror, and doing the whole thing of not showing us as much. But I mean, as it is, as an adaptation, it's fine. It could have been so much worse. It really could have. So yeah, and obviously there's going to be, like, Stephen King vibes and stuff like that. Like, I kept thinking, if this were a bad movie, it'd probably feel more like Cell. But as is, it sort of feels like it kind of got like a bit of The Mist in it a little bit. I don't know if it's the store scene that gives me that too. The store scene, another, staple in apocalyptic movies now, thanks to the likes of 28 Days Later and, well, the original Dawn of the Dead taking place in a mall, I guess, kind of is the pinnacle of this, but still, yeah, and then, and not only do they add climaxes, but, like, after it already feels like we've had one climax, this whole sort of, without saying too much, like a domestic scenario they kind of go into for seemingly way too long. And like I said, adding like a whole other half hour, I don't know. So, but like I said, it could have been worse, and it's a decent adaptation, but the smaller the better in this case it would have been, which is interesting, because obviously it does already feel small and low budget, but they could have gone smaller, and that's probably where they should have gone, just a little bit. So, yeah, that's how I feel about that. So, let's end on the house that Jack built. I don't think... I talked about Dear Wendy, like, a couple of years ago, which he wrote, but he didn't direct. I think apart from that, I have yet to discuss Lars von Trier on camera. So, we'll see how this goes. I was actually... When I was doing this in 2014 when Nymphomaniac came out, but I remember telling Owen as soon as I saw Nymphomaniac, I'm not reviewing that. but yeah, so going into this, there was a lot. This is one of those movies that had so much build up, like practically all year, at least since the summer, if not before. Where we had once, well, it was already kind of being built up like a year ago when he was putting it together, but then once it started getting seen by people, the hype started. Positive or negative, with a Von Trier movie, it doesn't matter. Hype is hype. So you've got, like, this, like, he's one of those directors where people were coming out of it, there were like, what was it, like 100 walkouts or something, they said, and then there were words like vomitive and torturous, pathetic, pretentious, just throwing all these adjectives at it, all these negative adjectives, and it's like the more you hear that stuff about a Von Trier movie, the more you think, I'm very interested to know what he's done now. So it's like it does anything but push you away from it if you're willing to embrace him at this point. If some people say I'm never going anywhere near something that piece of shit makes, I'm not going to judge you. I, if anything, it's like, I understand you entirely. But I think for me, there's always like a curiosity. And every now and then he makes a movie that I absolutely love. Dogville is a masterpiece. And I really like Dancer in the Dark quite a bit too. I have mixed feelings on his trilogy, but like what is the trilogy? Antichrist, Melancholia, and was Nymphomaniac the third one in that? And then like Breaking the Waves was in there. There's The Idiots. There's oh god, what else is there? The Kingdom. And that's the thing, is that this was built up as the movie that like totally and completely drove him to insanity for like the final time. Like apparently like he is obviously like struggling with like depression and alcoholism. He was in this really terrible place, this really ugly, disgusting place inside himself. And then he like got clean, and then supposedly making the house that Jack built, or writing the house that Jack built, got him back to where he was. It's like it basically ruined his life. So there's that whole thing, and it's so you feel like there is something here, and people were talking about how it's like one of the most vile, disgusting things ever. Well, here's the thing. First off, having seen the house that Jack built now, I would still probably chalk up The Kingdom as probably the most disturbed I've been. Like that movie just really fucked with me in a way I can't really describe. Like the whole birthing Udo Kier thing is kind of just, you know, one aspect of that whole thing. It just really sort of messed with me in this way that I don't think I'm going to forget. I think it messed with me more than this did, but I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there was so much build up to this, and the fact that if you know his filmography, if you're so aware of him, there's not much else he can probably do to shock you because of all the places he's already gone. And like I said, with all the people talking it up and all the word of mouth, by the time you get to the house that Jack built, if you've been following it, you're probably not going to be that shocked or surprised by anything. Like, if you're ready for it, if that's the case. So when it starts, we start off with the Uma Thurman segment, because we're going to do the 5 segments and then an epilogue. And each segment is like one. He said how many people he'd murdered, but I can't even remember now. But that's like in the hundreds, I think. But we're seeing these 5 specific ones that like had a certain, I guess, sort of an impact on how he, you know, progressed into serial killerhood in the next way. So, and that's the thing too that just kind of got me hyped, because it was like it makes you feel kind of sick too. But it's sort of like, when I started hearing the concept, I was like, why did it never occur to me until now that a Lars von Trier serial killer movie was exactly what I wanted to see in the weirdest way, just to see where it goes. So, and it's got plenty of places to go, and a lot of things it clearly wants to say, and many different, allegories to certain things that are totally similar and different at the same time. Like, they feel like they're on two different planets, but at the same time, maybe not so much. So, when you start off with this Uma Thurman segment, it might come off like it has a shaky start, because Thurman's performance is not the greatest. The dialogue is kind of terrible, and the whole thing just feels off, like the way it is, like how the fact that she sticks with him despite his extremely off-putting personality, and the fact that he's immediately aggressive towards her before she's even in his van. And then there's this weird off-aggressiveness about her, too. Particularly in the way she, immediately says, you're probably a serial killer, and if you were a serial killer, it's she points out all the ways he wouldn't be able to get away with it if he killed her and all that, despite the fact that he's going to anyway, and it's like I said, it feels like it's bad dialogue and it's bad acting and all that, except for Dylan. Dylan is amazing through the whole thing, of course, but... And it seems like Jack is... We actually see, sort of... He's still Jack, obviously, and he's still this, ruthless, disgusting serial killer, but it does seem like he is a different person, in a sense, in almost every segment. Like, the way that he actually is progressing as he gets further and further into this life that he's built over... I think it's set over, 12 years, I think it is. And so we can actually see his character visibly changing in one way or another as each segment happens, which he does amazingly. But still, as far as that goes in this segment, I do think that there's something intentionally off about it. He's shown in the past he's way too good at setting up and getting, great performances out of people and doing certain scenes in certain ways that... anything that feels really off about this scene feels like that's the intent, to make it feel like... Because when you immediately start off this way, it does kind of add a sort of uneasiness to it. It's almost unexpectedly done poorly, that there's no way that's not on purpose. I know that sounds like a very easy cop-out to defend a filmmaker, but I really am having a very hard time seeing it any other way. And then you get to the second incident, as they call it. And this took it in an interesting turn, because like I said, the Thurman story, the first one, is just very straightforward, despite that weird way that it's done. This incident, the movie goes in a direction that's... I struggle to say this, as you can tell. Okay, if anybody saw Todd Solondz's Happiness, particularly the scenes with Dylan Baker... You'll remember that movie had a lot of guilty laughs in it. Not only were some scenes just weirdly enough legitimately funny, but there was also just sort of that discomfort that made it really funny also, where you laughed out of nervousness more than anything else, despite the fact that it was sort of genuinely funny at its core too. That's kind of how this second one plays out. It feels very much like a Todd Solondz approach to black humor. So you've got, this whole segment where he's at the door, and he's first he pretends to be a cop, then he pretends to be somebody else, and it's so clear this guy's the most untrustworthy person on the planet. People are driving by, and he's waving to them, despite the fact of what he's about to do. And then the fact that he has to... Not only does he have to try multiple times to kill this person... but it's quickly revealed to us the OCD that he has about it. Where he has to keep going back to make sure that all the blood is clean, but for the most part the blood's not even there, it's just his OCD making his mind think it's there. And this whole segment, from the killing itself to that, is punctuated by this completely cartoonish, this whole big final... comedic ending to this segment, which interestingly enough is followed up when this whole cartoonish segment is done with something that looks like a scene out of What's Up, Doc or something. Ends up showing us what's probably one of the most nauseatingly gruesome shots of the movie. My stomach felt that shot, of showing the aftermath for quite some time while the movie was still going on, despite the fact all the other things this movie's throwing at you. So that is like, that immediately I was like, okay, I've got to know, because that was probably the first half hour, which means there were 2 hours to go. Needless to say, I was kind of hooked. So it's like, if reluctantly, I was hooked. So there's that. And then the third story happens, and this is kind of where we start getting a bit of a transition, where eventually, like, it is a serial killer movie. It's a Lars von Trier movie, but then it's gonna be like, it's gonna get really, really, really Lars von Trier eventually. So like you know, if you've seen his movies, if you watch the first segment, then you watch the second segment, and then we get to the third segment. By the time it gets to the third segment, it's about the time you're thinking, "There's no way this is what the whole movie is. This is going somewhere else." That's to say the least. So, but yeah, once it gets to the third segment, I was starting to feel like it was getting a bit. The third segment did feel a bit more like just kind of the easy shock value, where you bring kids into the mix. Then it starts to feel like that. You've got the whole duck scene like somewhere in the middle of this, and then by the time it got to like the moment with the pie, is when you kind of think, this feels more like somebody saying, like, instead of like somebody showing their innermost, sicknesses on camera, it's, the whole pie thing felt more like somebody saying, hey guys, look how crazy I am. This is what you wanted, right? And so that kind of loses its impact because of that. But, I mean, it's still like, totally, completely horrific. It's weird how, if Von Trier gets you in this frame of mind where you can just easily dismiss stuff like that, it's like, oh, that's just him trying to show off, and it's this really horrific thing. But even so, as I said, this is pretty much where we start to get a bit of a transition, where we go into stuff like, I mean, at this point I can see, like, Haneke comparisons or something like that, where it's like, where it's clear, a lot of people will probably take away from this, like, it's Von Trier trying to provoke the audience. Like I was talking about with the whole look at me sort of thing. Where it's like, it's him, basically trolling and saying like, hey, this is what you think I am? Well, here's this. But that's the thing too, is it's almost like it goes both ways, where it's like he's trying to provoke us, when it's so also clear it's almost like he was provoked by the criticisms he's received, where it's like, oh, so you thought, Antichrist was one of the sickest things you've ever seen. Oh, you thought Nymphomaniac went way overboard. It's like, no, this is overboard. This is what I can do. I can go even further than that. And it's like, so you get a sense that maybe there's something like that, but there's also this whole blurred line of maybe it's self-criticism, and he's like going in that direction, but also maybe, like, at the same time, it's like self-criticism and embracing what he's been criticized for and taking it farther. And it's like he's kind of trying, it almost seems like he's like doing both at the same time, and going all those different directions. You can take this a number of ways, though. This is a mind that's not easily dissected. Like, no matter how you feel about him as a filmmaker, he's not an easily dissected person. And you could, but once again, though, I totally understand if somebody takes this very much at surface level and just says, this is a cry for attention and I'm not going to give it to him. If anybody says that, I wouldn't, judge them for it. But at the same time, as I said, we got plenty of other directions to go. We eventually take this, well, it really kind of starts in this middle portion before we go to the fourth incident, but it kind of starts in the third segment also, with the whole setup and the way in which the murders are done. This whole World War II allegory and this whole going in that direction, with like World War II imagery and stuff like that, and like the footage, bringing Hitler into it because of course he is, because that's been his thing since the whole candle when Melancholia was there. That image of Kirsten Dunst's reaction is burned in my brain forever. But so, and then obviously that goes into, I would be doing it a disservice if I told you any more than that if you haven't already seen it. But it's, like I said, it's got directions to go. And like I said, they may seem totally different given where it ends up, and when we go from World War II imagery to a more different kind of imagery as it goes on. And yet somehow there is some sort of meshing here, but it does sort of, if there's one thing that kind of makes it feel like it loses its way in the middle there, it would be this whole segment, the fourth incident. where it seems to get really meandering, and it goes into the whole, once again, the whole misogyny angle, where he's been, despite getting, really strong, career-defining performances from people like, Emily Watson and Bjork and stuff like that. There is the whole misogyny criticism he's been given a lot. Kidman and Dogville, Charlotte Gainsbourg, and Christ, the list goes on, but it's like, once again, this scene with her and the way he berates her, and then it goes in the direction that it does, and it's like, is this... It's going in that direction somewhere, but the line starts to blur what even the point is. Like I said, whether it's self-criticism, or whether it's him saying, I can go farther just to provoke, or something else entirely. Like I said, this is like the one time I was kind of like, sort of zoning out of it a little bit, and there wasn't much here as far as strength, except for one recurring thing that's going on also, where it's like, the whole thing about, I was talking about earlier, about him waving to the dude, and how there's like, because this is another case where it's like, is it him portraying something in a certain way, or is he showing off himself? Because obviously, there's going to be a little bit of that, yourself thing, because of the whole Jack seeing his, murders as works of art, despite the fact that most people will see them as grotesque and disgusting, and and think he's a complete and total psychopath and evil and all that. But the fact also that he seems weirdly open to witnesses, where it's like the first guy that Uma Thurman points out, where she says, that guy saw us, you can't kill me now. Waves to the dude in the second one. The fourth one flat out tells the cops what he's gonna do. But it's like, it kind of shows like him basically saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. Do I have an audience or do I don't? And a lot of times people just kind of turn their heads away, like the witnesses do, and Jack can just do his thing to a blind eye, and that's what it is. And it's like, who's going to appreciate this, I guess, or at least see it? Maybe he doesn't care who appreciates it, as long as they see it. It's, yeah, like I said, so there's a lot of blurred lines, and like I said, he's not easily dissectable, so, which is probably why I've avoided talking about his stuff up until this point. But I've always kind of wanted to talk about Dogville, but I guess I'm not even sure where you begin. I just know that I love that movie so much. But the thing here also is, it does very much eventually turn into the whole... I mean, like I said, if you want to argue that he's not doing a certain, this is me and how I feel sort of thing, yeah, he does kind of get... And this is the point in time where I could totally see somebody saying, good God, I have never seen a filmmaker with their head so far up their own ass. When he's talking about atrocities in fiction, and like how they're the inner desires of people and stuff like that. And he does like try to contradict that as soon as he brings it up, and sort of see it as a debate or a battle here. But as this dialogue is happening, we get a greatest hits album from his own movies. Just a whole array of clips from everything from the birthing scene in The Kingdom to Antichrist to the end of the last shot of Melancholia. It's all here, and it's like, like I said, okay, this is the one point in time where it's like I said, I think I know what he's going for, but at the same time, if you want to dismiss it as self-indulgence, I think hardly anybody's going to argue with you. Even his fans, I don't think, would argue with you. But and then, as I said, it goes in a direction that I won't, reveal here, certainly, but, yeah, it's got many, many things up its sleeve, and many different directions it goes, and the ending, as far as I've seen, I think the ending is the most praised thing about it, like that last 15 minutes or so, leading into a, if obvious, so goddamn perfect end credits song. So, yeah, and the use of Bowie's fame throughout is interesting as well, so yeah, I can say I admire this thing, quite honestly. There's, like, a lot that I like about it, and with Dylan in its center. Dylan's one of those actors where, like, I've been hoping for a long time he'd get a part like this. He really deserves really good, meaty stuff to work with like this. And yeah, like I said, and there's so many things that are so clearly being said, and some things that are probably a bit more subtle. I know you immediately look at this, and subtle's probably the last word you're thinking of, but he's got a lot of stuff that he put in here, so it's gonna... I would say, usually this is the part where I say it'll take some rewatches, but I don't know. So we'll see. But like I said, I still think The Kingdom is probably his movie that's fucked with me the most. And like I said, you may be desensitized to this by the time you get around to it if you're aware of Von Trier's reputation and the movie itself's reputation before you even get to it. So, but yeah, that's how I honestly feel about it. So that's it for this week. Next week I've already got my ticket for Vice. I got it earlier today. So it'll be that, and it's hard to tell what else. Maybe with a more open weekend, they'll give us more. They'll give us awards movies around here. That would be really nice. So we'll see what happens. So yeah, and then obviously there'll be another versus and so on. So and then yeah. So until all that, that's it.